artificial intelligence device in the kitchen what the temperature was, and it said 40 degrees. I am not ready for that. So you can see I got my Mr. Rogers sweater on here today. All right, good morning. I'm Dan Finley. I'm the Executive Director here at the Saguaro Western Museum. And it's a privilege to welcome you here for another great program here at the Saguaro. Let me start by thanking the Saguaro Theater. They are gracious enough to open their doors. And I happen to think having programs like this from time to time at the Saguaro is just kind of fun. It's just such character, in this old theater. There's a lot going on at the museum right now. We've opened in the last 3 weeks. We've opened 2 different exhibitions. One, probably a lot of you know about, a lot of you have seen by now, the Barry Goldwater photographs. Absolutely incredible work done by the senator. And then secondly, we just opened an exhibition on Mexican folk art called Artesanía del Pueblo. And the Mexican folk art exhibition may be the most colorful exhibition we've ever done. There's such vibrancy to the artifacts, and it tells a great part of the story of Mexicans in this region. So please come for those 2 exhibitions when you get a chance, if you haven't done so already. With that, a shameless commercial, since we have you captive. Kathy Clark, are you out there? Come on up to talk about membership.
I'll only talk for about 45 minutes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for your membership. I see plenty of our members here, so thank you for your support. For those that are not members, I have a table right out there if you'd like to join today. Your admission fee will go towards your membership, and it is good for 1 calendar year. So you will get emails and notifications of events like this that we have all year long, as well as special previews for the exhibitions, the ones that Dan just mentioned. You'll get firsthand notice of those. So if you have any questions, please come see me in the back. All right, thank you all.
Thank you, Kathy. All right, let's get on with our program. As I think everyone here is aware, the museum 50 years ago had a devastating fire, and we thought to commemorate, and that is an appropriate word here, to commemorate that event. We thought we'd have this program here today. Let me ask, and I can barely see, but anybody here who lived through that fire? We know we've got 2 panelists, so we've got a few people. I see Deb and a couple of hands back there. So as we get into the program, for those of you who were here, by all means, you'll be asked to contribute. So please feel free to do that. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Dr. Eduardo Pergan, the museum's adjunct curator of history, who will be our moderator and will introduce our guests. So Dr. Pergan.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you. So, first of all, let me just start out by saying that I think it's a wonderful occasion that we have to celebrate, to commemorate 50 years of community resilience. That's really, to me, what this story is all about. It's not that the fire happened. The fire was, of course, a great tragedy. There was much that was lost that will never be replaced. But the fact that we're here now, we as an organization, as a museum, the fact that it exists is a testament to the resilience of this community and the support that this community has for not only the museum, but for remembering its past and its place in Arizona history. So to me, that's the real triumph here, is the fact that we're here today. So here's what we're gonna do. Let me do a couple of quick introductions to 2 ladies who need no introduction, but nonetheless, we're gonna do this. And then I've got some pictures of the fire and the aftermath as well that we'll just kind of go through very quickly. And then what we'll do then is I'll turn over to our panelists, and I think we'll start off with a question about what do you remember on that day? So it was 50 years in December, with the exact date, was it Yeah, it was 1 o'clock in the morning, so I think it was the 20th. So it's not quite yet 50 years to the day. We're getting pretty close. So we'll do that. So let me do this first of all. So I will begin with Royce Cardinal, again, who needs no introduction, but she is the former executive director of the museum, former board president as well. Is that correct? Former, yes, okay. And one of the things I find most interesting is that, in my mind, she was the founder of Las Señoras de Saguaro, tasked, and she can share that story with us, but tasked with this responsibility of gathering women of the community together to help rebuild the museum. And so you were the one that had the opportunity and the responsibility of creating that organization, which is alive and well today. So I find that most interesting. And perhaps even more significant, you're a graduate of Wickenburg High School. Yes, so is Julie as well. That's right. And I guess the last thing I want to say is that many of you were here, is that she was the recipient of the Elizabeth Hudson Smith Award for Western Women of Distinction. So we're so grateful to have you as part of this panel. And of course, next to me is Julie Macias Brooks, former Wickenburg Chamber of Commerce Director for over 30 years. Another graduate of Wickenburg High School as well. And of course, she is a descendant of some of the original founding families long before, can we say this, long before this was even Arizona? Yes, that's right. I mean, so her roots go all the way back. I like to say this about my ancestry as well, is that we're so rooted in Arizona that sand is flowing through our veins, right? And so she's one of the longtime caretakers of this place. So we're grateful to have you here. Here's what I will do then, by way just of a quick visual. So what we'll do is we'll tell the story of the fire through our various recollections. And as Dan mentioned as well, that some of you were here, some of you have your own stories. We'd love to hear them. Okay, so let me just share the slides, and then Julie, perhaps I'll ask you just to tell us a little bit about what's on the desk or the table, just so that people know what's up here, and Skip can jump in at some point as well. So, all right, so here's what we're gonna do. So before the fire, we have a few images, and I want to thank Emily Dykstra and Marianne for also helping us to find these images. But before the fire, this is what the street scene looked like. All right, there we go. Okay, let's go. There we go. Here's another image of the street scene. So that's what it looked like before the fire. Now, on the 21st of December, 1972, early on Thursday morning, 1:05, if memory serves me correctly from my research. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. Yes, here's a newspaper that showed up in the Arizona Republic. And this was a story about what happened. 1:07, there it is. The Wickenburg Volunteer Fire Department responded within 3 minutes of the call. And the blaze lasted for 6 hours. Now let me say this as a historian. I find this interesting as well. In the 19th century in the Old West, when everything was built out of wood, and people used fire for lighting and for heating as well, and that water was something that had to be carried into a location, fires were fairly common in the Old West. And we're dealing with a historic building, and so it's something that we don't live with anymore. But if we went back in time, that would be just part of reality, is that things burnt on a regular basis for those reasons. But so the fire lasted for about 6 hours. The building was built in 1905. It was the general store, as many of you know. Let's see what else we want to say about this. And what's interesting is, last right here, these two valuable items, the bronze art pieces, the Mountain Man and the Indian head. They're both original Remingtons. They were recovered with only slight damage. And I thought there was another art piece as well, but someone can correct me later on that. And here's, to me, this is what I was talking about before. Citizens of Wickenburg have already begun a fund drive to restore the museum. This article came out the day after. So again, it's a testament to the city of Wickenburg, the town of Wickenburg, that people rallied not only to save what was left of the building, but then to come back bigger and stronger and better as well. This is one of the images that we have of the fire. If you can imagine the blaze. All right, now a couple days afterwards, this is what was left. This is the old storefront. This is Frontier Street. You can see the water hose that's still lying in the street. So I believe this is probably the day after. Everything burned out, right? Here's another image. All right, just give you a sense of the damage. Everything was destroyed, as you can imagine. This is a stairwell. You can see how everything is terribly charred. There we go. Here's another image. Now, this is a couple days later now. The fencing was put to protect people from going in and wandering around, getting hurt, as you can imagine. The structure at that time was quite unstable. There we go. Here's another image as well. Now, this, I suspect, is when the building is being demolished at this point, because the roof is now off. There we go. All right, now the Wickenburg community begins to rebuild. And this image now, this is Tegner over here. All right, and then you see how the building is starting to come together, the new building right over there to the left. Frontier, as you can see where that truck is. Right? Now, all right, I include this image as well because Wickenburg, the goal of raising money was very, very close. And the amount that was quoted to begin the contract to begin building was $300,000. And so the community was very, very close to raising the money that was necessary for it. And this is part where Royce will come in. Now here's another image here. Once the building has been constructed, this is the front as we know it now. This is a group of firemen. Skip, where are you? Are you in this image?
One on the dark, second one on right.
Second. All right, right here. This is you.
Yeah, right behind Roscoe.
Okay, there you are. Okay. Then, as far as we could tell from the images as well, that there was a celebration afterwards. You can see the front. Of course, this is Frontier. I don't know if the trees are still were there. It looks like they were. But again, it looks a little bit different. It's not enclosed off to where we have the mud wagon now, but it's a little bit different. But there it is. And that's it in terms of the images that we have. So let's go ahead and do this. Let me then, let me turn the microphone over and tell us a little bit what's on the table to begin with. And then I want to start off with a question. That morning, it's not night now, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. What were you doing in terms of your jobs, and what do you remember of when the call came? So we'll start with an introduction of what's on the table.
Thank you, Skip, for bringing this. I'm glad that Emily was able to reach you for some props because it tells a story. For those of you that don't know, the Wickenburg Volunteer Fire Department, and John, you can correct me, is over 100 years old. And so our volunteer firemen had this shirt. They wore it proudly all the time, and that's really what they wore every single day. This community would not be the community we are or have the fire department that we have today without the volunteers. Skip and John, of course, can provide more details about the history of it once we go through the program, but our volunteers made a difference for every fire that came. This one hit hard, especially for the native volunteer firemen that grew up here. Skip was presented, he was secretary-treasurer for many decades, and when you are retired, you are presented a beautiful axe with your name on it. John Whitman, after 30 plus years, will retire very shortly, and I believe you will receive one too. It's a beautiful gift of the civic leadership that these volunteers have given to our community. and having a structure of a non-volunteer department over the years has expanded, as you see today, with the building of a new fire station at Wickenburg Ranch.
All right, thank you so much. So let's go ahead and start off with a question. 1 o'clock in the morning. Tell us, first of all, what were you doing then in terms of just your job? And then what can you remember when you first either got the call or learned of the fire? So we'll start there.
I was home in bed. However, our business, the Best Western Rancho Grande, had a red phone, and we answered the fire calls 24/7. And we also had a red button in the back, and we pushed that, and that would draw the firemen in by the whistle. And the volunteer fire department was still over on between where the library and town hall are now today. So my desk clerk called and said, the museum's on fire. Well, I right away called my dad and said, the museum's on fire. I believe it was Ruben Madrid who pulled me over on my way to the fire. And he said, I know, I just stopped your mother on the way here too. You're all going to the fire. Yes, we are. So my first arrival there was to stay out of the way because I'm not a firefighter. I cheered on the firemen that were present. And many people from the community, they always knew when the whistle blew. There was a fire, and you could hear it almost everywhere in town. And that was how I arrived there.
All right, thank you. And so, what were you doing in terms of a job at the time? What?
I was still instilled in a family business for 45 years and operated the Best Western Rancho Grande as well as the Gold Nugget Restaurant.
All right, thank you. All right.
Which also had a very serious fire not long ago, and Ruben Madrid got me again on the way to that fire. He and I still laugh about that.
All right, Joe.
Well, I just came back from my first semester of college for the holidays, actually, and had arrived about midnight. And I heard, my parents were asleep, and I heard the fire whistle. My dad was a volunteer fireman, and so we all got up. The reason I was home later than normal is I also worked at Goldwater's and did inventory for the Christmas holiday. And so it was just, we just couldn't believe it. But it reminded me of what I experienced as an 8-year-old, and that was when Johnson's Lumber caught on fire. And it was during the Smoke Eaters New Year's Eve bash that all volunteer firemen and most of the community went to, except those of us that were small and had to stay home or were babysitting with grandmothers. And so it reminded me of that. We all got up, just as Roy said, and we watched this fire burn down this institution that we all so dearly enjoyed, not only as families through our mercantile general store, but to help create a museum. And you just saw it all just go off.
All right, thank you. Now, Royce, one of the things I failed to mention was that your father was one of the founding members of the museum, if I have that correct. So tell me a little bit about the conversations then and the days afterwards that I'm sure you overheard as members of the board and the community came together to figure out what are we going to do now?
Well, as I recall, Carl Schride, who owned the ice company, was the first one to show up with a check. And it probably, for the first time in my life, I saw grown men cry. It was a very emotional start. Actually, the museum got started through the Roundup Club, which the Chamber of Commerce was then referred to. And they had a history committee, and they were determined they were going to have a museum in this town. They did so often, for several years. H.K. McLennan, again, who was superintendent of schools, he had a rusty old license plate collection. That was, and they used to rent whatever building was local, was in town during gold rush days. And they would put up all this stuff, which mainly was old rusty license plates. And HK was very, thought that was just great. And so out of that committee, which was a history committee at the Chamber of Commerce, began the Desert Caballeros Western Museum, also known as Maricopa County Historical Society.
And there's a bit of a story behind that, as I recall.
That was what Barry Goldwater said. He was on the board at the time, and he suggested they take the county name in hopes of getting some money, and that's never happened. In not only 50 years, but almost, what year are we in for the museum?
All right.
But it was Carl Schride and West, what was his name? He had an air conditioning place here. I know the house he lived in, I can't think of his name, which is very common to Wickenburg. We all know who lives on what hill and what street, but we don't know the street name.
There is, like Royce said, I mean, the tears continue to flow. Our beloved publisher, editor of the Wickenburg Sun, Mr. McCarroll, did numerous articles and photographs, as well as what you referred to from the Phoenix newspapers. Primarily, as Royce indicated, the checks came from local people, businesses, individuals, wealthy people, those of us that, worked throughout the community, a number of visitors who were here, whether it was 1 month or 3 months. You had kids working with adults. You had various organizations that came together, whether it was, and much like what was developed when the museum was first being put together. So everybody came back, and what was it, 4 years later, 5 years later, 3 years later?
On the anniversary.
My gosh, I mean, no community that I am aware of in a rural setting like Arizona had that amount of money contributed to be able to open their doors 3 years later.
Thank you. And I wonder if either of you can give us a sense of what was lost. What did the original museum contain that was irreplaceable?
Well, I go back beyond when it was a museum, when it was Brayton's Commercial. And it was a general store here in town operated by the Thurber family. And it was a 2-story building, which it was the night of the fire. And I remember Neil Haney. And you could buy your groceries down in the basement, and you could come up and buy a pair of shoes and jeans up ahead. And there were long-time family people who worked in that establishment for a long time. But most of us who grew up here, our wardrobes came from Brayton's. So it took me back, the fire did, to even those earlier days when we went shopping. And a lot of local characters worked in that store for a long time. They knew what size you wore, and
When you walk through, what we lost early ranching photographs, Hispanic history, many photographs of the early families. Many people had donated personal items, whether it was a belt buckle or a rocking chair or, a photograph that was on their wall. That's what was lost. And I don't know how the Roundup Club, Wickenburg Chamber of Commerce didn't lose everything. Because it was probably, because it was up front, and within 3 minutes the volunteer fire department was there, they were able to move everything out. And that was one of the very first things when I took over the chamber here 34 years ago, was how in the world did you save all this? Because we would have just lost, again, as the oldest organization in the community, we would have lost all of that history too. So, one hand, yes, we lost a lot, and the other hand, we were able to save some.
Thank you. Now, before we move on from the fire, and Skip, perhaps you may have a memory or two, but as I read, the suspicion was that the fire started in the basement. Probably electrical, but was there any other firm conclusion about the origin of the fire?
Started in the furnace room.
Oh, the furnace room, all right. Let me give you a microphone.
No,
Okay, so folks can hear you.
well, we surmised, but I wasn't on the fire department at that time. But right soon after that, they figured it started in the furnace room. It could have been electrical or whatever. I don't even know whether they used coal or gas or whatever they used in the furnace. So it started in the furnace room. Okay.
Skip the reluctant.
Thank you. All right. Now, Royce, you have a document there. Was there something that, some statements or comments you wanted to read?
Oh, no, but I did think the gentleman's name that followed the shrine,
Okay.
Wes Sizemore. I couldn't come up with it at the time.
There you go. Okay.
And they were the first donors. I believe they immediately contacted all of the Desert Caballeros riders, which although never truly associated with the museum, they were destined to become the front runners of the money coming in to rebuild. And the name sounds familiar. It's the Desert Caballeros Ride, and which happens every year in April. And those members from out of town, many of them became quite large-sized donors for the museum.
So thank you. On that note, then tell us a little bit as we read from this article that very morning of the fire. Now again, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. So that very morning, community starts to rebuild, starts to gather. Tell us a little bit about that process of getting money. I imagine donations, small and large, as well as you mentioned, is about the campaigns. Were there organized campaigns, or were just people just kind of filtering in all the time?
There were committees, there were fundraising committees, there were other people. Well, one of the things that occurred immediately after the fire, the site became a dumping off place for anything anybody thought was historical. And some of it was usable, and a lot of it wasn't, most of it was donated. But it did lead in downward like this because we have a very strong collection policy now at the museum. So there's no dump and run. If you want to take it to the dump, do that. Don't bring it to the museum because they have a collection committee that works to keep the items authentic, and it's quite a study process that goes on. That's what I do remember, and all of a sudden all this stuff was accumulating, and people took things out of their homes to donate, and if they had any multi-generational people in the community had items that were of great value to them that maybe didn't quite qualify for museum quality. But that's where, once they started to roll, they could afford to build most of the shell of the building. And that was probably about the time when my dearly beloved superintendent of schools, H.K. McLennan, you'll hear that, he was really, even if you had a rusty license plate you had to put up with, it was okay. And, anyway, that's when Mac McLennan came to me and said, hey girl, we need some women to get involved in this organization. These guys are knocking their legs off trying to raise all this money. Can you help us gather a group of women and start an auxiliary? And that was how Las Sonoras began. It's also become a multi-generational group of women who have some of the daughters and granddaughters are now members of the board and have kept that going. And it was through that help. The biggest project we took on was making and selling a God's Eye to everybody in town. And we stood out on the corner. Some of you probably sat for hours making those God's Eyes. We raffled off. We had a couple of ponies for our two oldest daughters, and one tried to drag my daughter, and so we wanted to get rid of them. We walked with them in the Gold Rush Day Parade and auctioned them off, and the museum benefited from that. And we got rid of 2 stubborn animals. It all comes back around. The book, we undertook a book, and it was a group of Las Sonoras women, mostly board members who had started it. And we decided, well, let's write a book about history. But the other thing we did, which would be most valuable now, we published a post office box directory. Everybody knew where everybody lived, but nobody knew how to send them a birthday card. That was we sat at a card table for hours in front of the post office. That was when it was still at the old location. And people could sign up to be in this book. And I did not end up with one, but I would love if anybody has it. I'd love to, the museum might have one, I'm not aware. But the God's eyes were the main thing. And
so I have this image of you standing on the corner, probably Frontier or Tegner, and just waving at people and trying to sell God's eyes.
That was it. It was out on the corner of Apache and Tegner, where we had it was kind of a permanent booth. So we caught all the walk-around tourists as well as local people. The other thing we did, and I've been blamed for this for the last 60 years, we needed to come up with a name for our book. And we all struggled with that. We all had taken different, the guest ranches, the mining, the main topics of history, the early family. And we were a productive group of people. But when we came up with the name, the community went, what does that mean? Well, it was the right side uptown on the upside down river. I thought it was quite original, and I got blamed for it.
If they know their history, they would know exactly what that meant.
And it was taking the majority of buildings in downtown Wickenburg and recreating in print what those had been previously and what they were at that date. And we sold those. And it was a lot of work, but we got her done. And our Las Sonoras was set up that they could not wiggle out of giving money to the museum. They are obligated, they have to give every cent they raise, less the production cost of a project or an event. That all goes to the museum. And during the years, there was some thought maybe they didn't want to do that anymore, but they've held fast to what their founding paperwork called for. So they've donated millions of dollars over to the museum, cheerfully. They were also the first operators of the museum store when we reopened the new museum. And I must have wanted to live a fairy tale. We had these beautiful white aprons that said Las Sonoras de Saguaro. The women volunteers hated them. Did you wear one, Sandy? That was after you, before you. Yeah, and I thought they were just enchanting to be identified as a group, and they all went, you really want you have to tie that big bow in the back.
But they were beautiful, and there's a picture that I cherished that had Royce and Carolyn Corbett in these beautiful aprons, and they reminded you, like the Harvey girls, and the welcoming, the hospitality, and I just thought that was very smart marketing. My mother was part of Las Señoras as well, and it was just a beautiful image of these women coming in to help the restoration again of the revitalization of the new Desert Caballeros Western Museum. I see Mike Taylor. Please stand up, Mike, for a minute. I know you're going to yell at me, but please stand up.
We can't see you.
Mike was one of the firemen, and I know that I want him to tell some stories about what he experienced, and of course he grew up here. Many of us did, and as young graduates of high school, many of them volunteered, just like John, of course, and others. But that's the story that needs to be stated, was those that were present and those that are still serving.
Thank you. Are you okay with that? Let me go back here to this image here. So as we're, there we go. Hang on, there, that's it. All right. So before we get to this, I do want to ask two questions now about Las Señoras. First of all, who came up with the name Las Señoras de Saguaro, the ladies of help? Who came up with that name? And secondly, this is more importantly, what was the nucleus of this group? Did you just pick up the phone and start calling your friends, or how did this all work?
Let's start on your friends first. You'll get the furthest if you have a reliable group of friends. And they all jumped. They all said, we'd love to serve on the opening event. And
who
they
came up
did.
with the name then? I'm intrigued by that.
Do you know what the name means? You probably do.
Yes, the Ladies of Help.
Ladies of
Yes.
Help. I don't know. We researched looking for something similar to that, and that's the name that stuck. So.
All right, wonderful. All right, thank you. Let me go ahead. Julie, did you have anything you wanted to add? Okay. All right. Let's get back and let's get a few recollections of the firefighting in general, Wickenburg, but also this particular event. Thank you so much for volunteering.
What do you want to know?
What do you recall from that morning, 1 o'clock in the morning, the alarm goes off?
Yeah,
What do you recall?
we had just, forgot what they called them. They weren't pagers at the time. There's some you kept at home and they woke you up and cops told you what was going on. What I remember, I was on the first truck when Bobby Ortiz was driving, but I don't remember anybody else that was on the truck. And we went to the basement and went in the building. There was like fire going across the ceiling. We sprayed water in there. I don't know what was going on up at the street. That was a different truck. I didn't know they were taking stuff out of the building. We were down below. I think Chester was a fire chief, Chester Davis. He finally called everybody out of the building when they decided they couldn't save it. I do remember being on top of the phone company building next door, spraying water onto the roof. I remember the roof falling in, kind of just hovered sort of, just fell into the building. After that, we spent hours walking through there, putting out little fires and stuff. That's about all I remember, really.
Thank you. So as you pull up, it sounds like the building was not engulfed at that point. The fire is spreading. So it's enough so that people can actually run in and try and save a few things.
Well, like on the street, I don't know if they could see any fire or not. Down below, it really was just smoke until we went into the building. I'd only been on the fire department about a year at that time, so yeah, don't remember much.
How quickly did the fire spread then once you arrived and then the whole thing?
It was hours before the roof actually fell in. It was still dark, I believe, but it was 3-4 hours probably before that happened. They were, I'm sure they were going into the building up above. You know, there would have been more smoke, more fire up there than there was in the basement. But being there was fire on the ceiling in the basement, there was probably substantial fire upstairs. I was upstairs after they decided that nobody should go in the building anymore. A lot of people showed up around that, standing out in the street.
All right, thank you. If I could ask you one last firefighting question. So you, just any fire in general, but perhaps this one in particular. So you arrive on scene. Obviously you want to put the fire out, but you're probably laying down some protective spray on the rest of the building as well, trying to wet everything down so the fire doesn't spread. What strategy do you employ when you arrive on scene? I mean, beyond obviously just trying to get to the heart of the fire.
Well, on any fire you have to determine what's on fire. Sometimes you just smoke coming out. Most house fires you ventilate the roof to give it oxygen so that you can't put it out quick. But like that was a flat roof.
so last question. So 1 o'clock in the morning, the alarm goes off. I imagine you probably got a couple of hours of sleep and you were on site for several hours after that. What time do you think everyone went home after, daylight comes, building collapse? How long were you actually on site?
It was late afternoon.
Late afternoon, okay. So all day long, it sounds like basically all day long.
Well, whenever if they suspect arson or anything like that, then until an investigator gets there, we kind of protect the site. That's when Johnson's dry goods caught on fire, I remember being there for a long, long time, start in the middle of the night, be there till late afternoon. You have to, then they go through it, and we hang around while they're, trying to figure out what happened. That's not really our job.
All right, thank you so much. Yes? Oh, point us out. So the question is, which one are you up there on that photograph?
I'm the driver.
Okay, the driver. All right, with the hat on, right?
Yeah, the guy standing behind me is Al Long. The guy sitting behind me is Bobby Arquidez. And then Chester Davis is the fire chief up on top, also in the glass. And then at the front of the truck is Harry Needham. And then next one is George Wilkins, and Bill Heathman, Skip Blunt, Connie Orozco, Mark Workman, Lou Churchill, Rudy Gates, Ken Schultz, Dale Hoskins, Buck Walters, Willie Herskowitz, Larry Steinberg, and Jim McGuffin's up on the back of the truck.
That's impressive. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Any other recollections from our folks here in the audience you want to share about that particular event? So Julie, tell us a little bit about the Chamber of Commerce then. This, of course, there's a deep organizational interest in the museum. It starts off as actually part of the Chamber of Commerce.
Well, it was a committee, and Mr. Weeks was the executive director at that time. HK and many others, Mr. Coxwell, they were on the board of directors. And for years they had been talking about, keeping our history so that the future generations would know who we are. And that's really, it was around a table. Of course, we were not in the Santa Fe Depot at that point. We were in the Brayton store. So they had I guess it was maybe as big as the stage area. And that's where they decided that they would start the Desert Caballeros Western Museum. It's great pride in the fact that, the business owners at that time, maybe 25, 30 members, maybe a little bit more. I think they started raising membership on that side as well, and by the 70s they had about 200 members or so. And all of them took great investment in any type of cultural or art history in keeping Wickenburg's information local. So yes, the Roundup Club, DBA, Wickenburg Chamber of Commerce, has always had a great partnership with the Desert Caballeros Western Museum.
Thank you. And what I find most fascinating, of course, is that so much of this is volunteer work. The fire department is volunteer work. The beginning of the museum comes out of volunteer work as well. What impresses me is that a community of volunteers were able to actually pull together a historical site with history, with pieces of history there, artifacts. Was this all, I mean, I guess it's all self-taught, I guess what I'm getting at, is when was the first professional museum person brought on site to the museum itself? Would you know that question? Otherwise, see, I'm getting this image that this is a community of people just coming together and doing something quite remarkable.
That's real Wickenburg. I mean, that's who we are. I mean, that's just, whether it was a fire that brought you all together, a death that brought you all together, a celebration, that's just Wickenburg. And most of us today still do the same thing. But wasn't it Harry Needham Freedom was our first professional. I guess he and his wife had a business here, but he was the first professional.
He really was not a museum-trained person, but if you look at the photograph up here, he's on the far left. That's Harry. He and his wife operated a store over on Apache Street called the Mr. and Mrs. Shop. And he became probably the best ever at grabbing volunteers. And everything happened on a volunteer basis. And Los Sonores women all took a room to do. Other high school kids came and painted. I think the Herskowitz brothers carried away most of the debris from the fire. And it was, but there was also something else happening at the time, which I think fits into this portion of the show. The guest ranches, who were always very, the multi-generational families that operated were all big sponsors of the museum and still are to this day. Whether it was 2 generations of Gams from Rancho de los Caballeros, or if it was 2 brother and sister from the Burden family who had Bermuda Ranch, Vi Wellick and George Wellick at the Flying E Ranch. Many of those people served on the board over the many years, but that also brought, that's when they started developing home sites around their various dude ranches. And out of that became what I always considered the golden marriage of strong volunteers and people who moved to Wickenburg who had a little extra money. And that was a marriage made in heaven, because they became, well, they've been supporting the museum for 60 years. And they brought an expertise. Many of them were associated in museums in their big city places in the East. But they took to the streets of Wickenburg with a vigor and breathed a new life into the project known as the museum. And they had the funds more available than many of the local people had. But the idea of putting a volunteer with a valued person who had some extra change and many dollars, and that was the beginning of that relationship, which has done continuing with the museum over the years.
Thank you for that. So one of the things that I find so impressive about the Desert Caballeros Western Museum is the amount of original artwork, historic, classic artwork that you can find. And I'm always raving to my friends, you've got to go, you will not believe what you will see there.
Well, I think almost single-handedly that would be the Aiken Fisher collection that he was very highly associated with the Renners, who were art dealers who helped him. And I can remember being on the board at that time, and Aiken would wander in and say, well, I want to give you this painting. And the board would go, now we have to pay how much for insurance to insure this beauty of a picture? And that remained the cry, because operating dollars weren't as generous as gift of art. But Aiken and his wife Jane were certainly the movers and shakers of that the development of the art collection.
About what time period is this, are we talking?
A long time ago. Yeah. I'm trying to think. Well, when I was back when I was chairman of the board, I got a daily visit from Aiken Fisher.
Oh, wow.
To say, well, here's what we should be doing. Okay, are you going to pay for it, Aiken? Yeah. Who's going to pay the insurance?
So I'll give you the mic in just a second. Let me just say a couple things. So again, what I appreciate about the museum is, to me, the blending of both history and art, and historic art. To me, it's seamless, and it's one of the great strengths of this museum. But the article that I had up there, mentioned that there were a couple of original Remingtons. So that relationship between local history and the art of the West seems to have been part of the seeds of the museum from the very beginning.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
I was fortunate to be on the board for 2 terms as well, and we had decided that we had a large collection that Aiken had again funded. And then, because of my marketing background, we created a marketing committee to then do more marketing, national marketing, as well as state marketing, and invited Arizona Office of Tourism officials to come to Wickenburg to see what we had with this great institution. And of course, just like most people that walk in, and they're just amazed, as you said, of the collection that we have. So that really, every time there was a donor of that caliber, there was a press release and photographs, and then professional photographers and so on. And where the museum is today, with actually having, on staff their own professional PR person. So Caesar's been a great addition to the staff, and we're always excited. Where is Caesar?
There you go.
Yay!
Thank you. So now tell me about Barry Goldwater's piece to all of this. When did he become involved with the museum? Was it after the fire or before the fire?
It was before.
Okay, so it's before. So then tell me, how did that come about?
Well, another marriage of politicians and people out supporting the museum came together, and I'm not sure who was instrumental in getting Barry Goldwater to actually serve on the board. And it was his thought, a native Arizonan, that Maricopa County should want to support our museum in Wickenburg, and they thought it was too far away from Phoenix. And now we look how close we are and go, oh wait, they're coming after us.
Well,
And we want to maintain our local dignity and
not be a suburb. But going back to your question, Senator Goldwater, and whether it was, Governor Fannin or any of the other governors and Arizona politicians, they loved coming to Wickenburg. And we got them here for Gold Rush Days. And they were either grand marshals or, rode in a car in Division I or whatever it may be, over the life of their service. And just as Roy said, Barry Goldwater loved photography. And what a beautiful place Wickenburg has for photographers. He knew his state. He knew that Wickenburg was founded in 1863, the 5th oldest town in Arizona. And I think that he was probably quite proud of whoever asked him, whether it was Roy Coxwell or HK or Hal or, whoever. But I believe that he did not hesitate to want to be on the initial board.
I believe a lot of that occurred out of a little group of people who had coffee every morning at the Gold Nugget restaurant. And it was called the Wickenburg Coffee Club. It started up in a restaurant on Frontier Street and eventually worked its way to the Gold Nugget. But the whole joke about that was if they invited you in as a guest, you got to buy coffee for all the people that showed up that morning. And it was a daily event. You got a free cup if you bought coffee for everyone else. But a lot of those discussions took place at the Wickenburg Coffee Club. And I think quite a number of our people were politically involved in the state over the years. I can remember when Rose Mofford was governor, and our own former police chief in Wickenburg was his main guard, I guess was the name for it. He was a DPS officer at the time. And Raul Castro was at the opening of the museum.
That
And
might
the
have
one
been
that
him,
showed
yeah,
the parade.
Yeah.
And that was quite an event. And another governor, when we opened the museum park came when we dedicated the park, and I don't remember who. I
It
don't
was
remember.
Governor in '88.
Yeah.
I can't remember. Bill, you remember Governor in '88? Okay.
But we've always been able to draw those type of people in. Some have been very helpful.
Pardon? No, no, it wasn't
No.
Mika.
Babbitt.
Babbitt came up several times, yeah. And Tony Melendez, who Royce was referring to with the DPS detail, was also Babbitt detail, as well as Governor Mofford. So we've had, as Royce said, we used to be able to pick up the phone and going through files, the letters that were written for, really from 1931 to even when I retired, who always wrote letters to politicians on behalf of our community.
So the image that I'm getting out of all of this is that not only is Wickenburg resilient, but entrepreneurial and even scrappy. Is that fair to say? I mean, it's quite a remarkable story. Not only that the museum was rebuilt, how it was rebuilt, and the fact that it existed from the outset, right? Is that, again, people coming together and having these ideas, and it's, you know how it is, people can talk, and talk is cheap, but then talk moves to action. And then here we are, right? Here we are, much, much later. We're all the benefactors of good ideas and good actions and goodwill, I guess, is the other thing as well. All right, wonderful. So let me ask again if there are any memories, as we've been kind of talking about, not only the fire, but also the development of the museum. And I'd love to hear if there are any other memories that folks would like to share. I just want to say, again, what I find so interesting is that as the museum is being rebuilt, and you mentioned that people are bringing things from their homes, which is, again, just impressive to me, very valuable things that they wanted to share and keep with the museum. But at some point then, again, the professionalization of the museum takes place. And again, then becomes this facility that it is now with international recognition with the Cowgirl Up, which is coming next spring. I mean, all of these things, it's phenomenal. It's a phenomenal story. Let me open it up to kind of open mic. Are there, yeah, okay.
Eddie Meegan was governor in '88. I remember Eddie Bashan was also up here at that time for that opening of the park. I had heard, Royce and Julie, that when we had trouble getting collections. We had trouble getting collections the second time after it burned because so many people had given a lot of their really good stuff. Can you address that a little bit?
Well, oftentimes people keep, if they've given something that was precious to their family, to a cause or to a collection, then they kind of resent the fact you burned it up. So it's an emotional process for a person to give or a family to give something. So it was a little difficult collecting things, but as I said, that's where we became a dumping spot. When people had something they wanted to get rid of, they brought it to the museum. But when we sought accreditation and achieved that, we had to strengthen some of the policies, and that was one thing that a museum of any class has an obligation to care for that item forever. They can't dispose of it usually. If they do, there are a lot of rules that go along with the collection committee, which is one of the very key parts of accreditation.
See, again, this is what I find so remarkable about the museum is that, as you know, there are many communities in Arizona that have their own little historical societies. They don't all go on to become accredited museums. And that phenomenon in itself it's just amazing. It's an amazing story.
Well, Bill, in regards to some resentment, there were for those that donated photographs. And so it took a long time to build that back up, and I'm going to refer to the Hispanic Pioneer photo collection. And many of the families, you know, did not want to donate again. And we had to really talk them into it that if we didn't tell the Hispanic pioneer story of Wickenburg, then it would be lost, because it was not mentioned at all until the first book that Las Señoras put together. And it was a small piece to that book. And so we were able to convince them on that side. And then people started finding other photographs, not only the Hispanic families, but many of the ranching families. And so that collection, that photo collection, basically started to build again.
All right, thank you. Are there any other recollections or comments?
The other thing was H.K. McClellan, I had always heard, it wasn't just the wealthy people that rebuilt the museum. He went around and collected the coins out of your pocket. Can you address that?
That he did. He wasn't a fundraiser. He was a school superintendent. And Julie and I both, being you pointed out earlier, we were both graduates of Wickenburg High School and Wickenburg School District. The life that Mac McClennan led in this town, there was never an event in town that the school didn't partner. And teachers, there was a law then, a rule, that you had to live in Wickenburg and you were going to do it Mac's way. You were going to participate in a community. And that, with all the affordable housing and some of the civil rights, I guess, have changed that. You can't designate where a person lives. But the world was just a better place when H.K. McClennan was on the planet. And we all have great, school was good, we were safe, but none of the challenges we have today.
I recall there was, you know, on the chain sign, that he gave you a can. He gave, kind of like the Catholics during, you know, Easter. You get a can, you fill it up, and then, you know, you give it to the church afterwards when we were kids. Mac did the same thing. And you were so excited when that can, I mean, it wasn't very big, but when you got that can full of change and you got to hand it to him, man, that was just really a great feeling that we were all contributing. So, yes, he was a dynamite person, and one that we'll never forget. And others like him, Bill Bass, he, you know, great photographer, comes from, you know, the family that just traveled the Colorado and Grand Canyon photographers, and he loved Wickenburg. So he took pictures, and I'm sure that the photographs are still at NAU, but pictures of the fire, pictures of everything, good, bad, and ugly. You go to Bill Bass photo information, and that will pull up as well. And while I'm talking about him, just this morning, Arizona Highways, on their 1957 issue, is the cover of Las Damas. And the first two women in the horseback ride, much like Desert Caballero's ride, is two fantastic women, Lucy Bainge and Mrs. Morton Bodfish. So it's that kind of, again, it's bootstrap PR that occurred from the early part of Wickenburg to where we are today, that we're able then to share our history, whether it's about the museum, the chamber, or community in general.
Thank you for that comment, for prompting the memory as well. That one thing I did not appreciate, that this is a generational effort, or was a generational effort. I mean, it's one thing to understand that adults can contribute dollars. I didn't realize children are actually going around collecting coins as well. That's fantastic.
My husband's wanting me to talk, and I'm a little embarrassed, but first question I have is for Royce. Is that book still available that Las Señoras did? That'd be a wonderful fundraiser for us. A reprint.
Well, I think we want to bring it up to date, because that was back in the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that would be a
That'd be a
fabulous one.
great project for
Yeah.
the current Las Señoras.
Yes, I.
It's a lot of work. I
Yeah.
have a dog-eared one I love
I'd love to see it. That'd be awesome. Thank
Okay,
you, Royce.
I'll loan it to you.
That'd be terrific.
Remember, it's the right side uptown on the upside down river.
I love that. I love the title. I think it's great. As a volunteer at the museum, somewhere along the line I heard that the two Remingtons that were in the fire, that the only reason that they were saved is that they fell through the floor. Is that correct?
That's the way I understood it.
It's always nice to have
They were
this
found in the basement.
trivia. That'd be a pretty good fall. I mean, yeah, and that they weren't damaged. That's pretty cool.
They had some damage and they were repaired.
Okay.
It was also, that brings to, train of thought went away. It leaves me behind sometimes. Tell me again what you were asking about.
About the Remingtons going through the floor.
Statue.
And you
Yeah.
said there were some repairs done too.
One of the things that occurred when Aiken Fisher was doing his great thing in generosity was when the thanks for the rain, he provided that to the museum, which is in the museum Crossroads Park. And the day that it was delivered, Aiken was so proud that he had been responsible for this. And it rained that afternoon as the statue was being set where it still is.
See, that's a good story to share. That's a good story. Yeah.
That was a good story. We have a lot of good stories, and we have a lot of good luck, and we've had a lot of good supporters over the years.
The good stories are really good for all the volunteers. I did live here when the fire happened, and my father was visiting from California. So I got up that morning, and my current husband had been with the highway patrol, and he had evidently come in and told my dad, "You're not going to the museum today, it burned down last night." So it's, that's really strong in my mind.
All right, thank you. Any other comments or observations or questions as well? Over here.
You talked about your history with the Braden Commercial Company, shopping there. And now, the next thing we see is the chamber and the museum. How did the Braden Commercial Company turn that property over to, or how did you get it?
Sky Thurber, he and his wife, Liz, I believe was her name, they owned a piece, it's a little complicated even for me. They owned a piece of property that they sold to the town of Wickenburg, where the current community center is. And Thurber's donated a portion of the building. They didn't give the full thing, but they gave a great majority interest in their store becoming the museum. Does that explain it very well? Probably not. Yeah.
And then eventually, I believe, Mrs. Thurber, didn't she pass away? Yeah. And then eventually, I believe the board then purchased whatever, Dan may have this in file, I don't recall. I think there was some exchange. But the Brayton store was actually by the Brayton families, and they had, they were the general mercantile from early Wickenburg. They also had, excuse me, a store in Bouse area, if you were heading to Parker that way. So the Braytons were early, much like the Goldwaters or the Hirschwitzes that had their little buggies and carriages and carried whatever was needed to the mine supply area, basically, and then built up their stores, whether it was Bouse. Wickenburg was the main store, and that's why it's a bigger store. And then the Thurbers purchased it, I believe, from the Braytons.
All right, thank you. Any other comments or questions, observations? All this is a great opportunity that we have and that we've had to hear a little bit about the deeper history, I was going to say untold. It sounds like parts of this history is already written down, recorded in certain places, but we need to find a way of either reprinting or updating, right, the story.
There was a publication published on the 50th year of the museum. It's called Crossroads, and it's still available at the museum store, I believe. And that was a project I got to work on after I left the museum. And I did kind of oversaw the publication of that book, but it's a nice coffee table book if you don't have one, and that tells a lot of the detail, and I think you referenced some of it in a document that I got.
Yeah. So there's a book by,
Dr. Mark Pry that we worked on with him. And then, I don't know, does the museum still have that? Is that still available?
yeah.
We need to get all those books redone and a couple of videos that we worked on that were awesome. And that will then tell more of the story that you're hearing.
It sounds like this is a project now for one of our anniversaries coming up for the museum. We'll pull this all together and do a reprint or something like that. All right, well, in the absence of any further questions or comments, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank our panelists in particular for sharing your stories with us, your memories. And what I've enjoyed is just our collective recollection of that night and how things came together that kind of led us to where we are now. Thank you everyone for being here and for your questions, your observation, comments. Do we have a final question or comment?
This has been such a wonderful presentation, and if you didn't videotape it, I'm sorry.
We did.
It is perfect. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Caesar is always on the job, so thank you. All right, one more back here. Yes.
I just wanted to say one thing. I remember, I wasn't here for the fire, but Brayton's was a place that I went to often. And I remembered walking through the building and the wood floor would squeak. So I can just imagine how the fire just consumed that. Thank you again for your presentation.
All right, Dan, do we have, all right, Dan, can I turn it back to you? Is there any final comments you want to say? All right.
You can close it off.
All right, well, thank you so much, everybody. Dan has given me the authorization to close it off, so with that, thank you, and have a good day.